There had been a Christian Missionary Alliance church here called Trinity Chapel. It had dwindled down to about 12 people, and almost all were seniors. But they did something that is hard for most people, never mind those in their 60s. They embraced change. And many of you know and love Richard Wilson. He is the lone remainder of that group, and can tell you stories about the past. He's our resident historian. These folks entrusted their church and their property to a 30-year-old dreamer with little ministry experience. And as a result, they lived to see their church die and be reborn. We owe them a debt of gratitude. May their example be multiplied many times over. Prior to the kickoff of the church, we made phone calls from what is now the staff office. We called the phone company and ordered 10 phone lines, a strange request, I know. And we set up a phone room and put in these 10 phones and made 10,000 dial-ups to the people in Belleville and Nutley in something known as the Phones for You program. And this was like a 9-week plan, 4 weeks of call-in, 4 weeks of mailing, and then another phone call follow-up and so on, and then a big grand opening. And in the midst of that very busy time, my wife was out to here, pregnant with my son Andrew, who was born 6 weeks before the church officially opened. Our first staff person was a fellow by the name of Tim Barnes, who some of you know and love. I remember vividly, we were having a free car wash out here on Hancock's Ave. This was in the days before we had lot paved, so we just did it right on the street. We didn't ask permission of the town. We learned very early on that it's much easier to ask forgiveness than permission. So you just do it, please go on. So we just put up phones and we washed people's cars, and they wanted to pay us. We said, oh no, it wasn't our idea. We stole it from other churches, of course, but we said, you know, this is a way to show the love of God in a practical way. So we just washed people's cars. It was great. And there's one occasion this fellow was really impressed by it, so he came up to Tim Barnes and asked him if he would bless his crucifix. And I don't think Tim had his theology all figured out on that yet, so he did what any good assistant pastor would do. He brought him over to me. I'm not sure I had my theology all figured out on that either, so I don't remember what I said or did, but we welcomed Jim Kalakis to our fellowship, and Jim found Christ here. I remember being with another fellow who we met through the phones, Phil Cornell, who's out at another church out in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, Alliance Church there. And Phil was new in his faith, and Phil was a chain smoker, as was Jim, and Phil and I led Jim to Christ in Jim's smoke-filled living room. It was great. I think it was Jim. But Jim found a spiritual home here. His daughter lived out in Colorado. She was a sister in the faith and was so glad to hear that her dad found a place where he could hear the gospel and commit his life to it. And when Jim died, his health wasn't great a few years later. She was so grateful. She was here and just grateful to meet the people that were a part of her dad's life in his closing years, and was so grateful that he found faith. Tim Barnes left us to plant a church in West Milford, New Jersey in 1998. And that same year we began to take interns through the seminary in Niagara, New York. And yesterday I counted, and I didn't think the number was this high, but there have been 17 interns through our church over these years. One of them, intern number 2, was one I at first tried to avoid taking on. He seemed a bit brash, and even had a reference that was unfavorable. But Paul Kaplan was a great intern, and now is a lifelong friend. After Paul returned to seminary for the 3rd and final year, he got married and came on staff here for 4 great years before transitioning to Central Asia as a missionary in the 1040 window. Les and Twyla Brickman came to us from Kansas in 2003 and were impact players. We learned how to do home cell groups and a whole lot more through them. And many of you served well beyond the capacity of what you thought you could do, thanks to them, and the way they challenged you to step up and give more than you thought you possibly could. We thought it would be hard to lose them, and of course, it was. They left a significant void. We had to place all of our hope and all of our confidence in Christ, our all-sufficient Savior. He is all we need. I have touched base on the past here at Riverside Community Church and summarized a whole bunch of years in a very short time. This being my last Sunday and the need for a successor is the present. at Riverside Community Church. And in a moment, I'd like to touch briefly on the future. But note first in verses 21 through 23 that Paul explains what Christ's identity and accomplishments mean for us as he talks about the past, the present, and the future. Verse 21, our past. He says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Prior to belonging to Christ, Paul's saying, it's not that you were just not talking to God, but you were enemies of God. Enemies by our local choice. The Bible isn't pulling punches. It makes it very clear. Until we know God through his Son Christ, we're as though enemies, because there is this separation that is there because we stubbornly refuse not to believe. That's the way the Bible sees it. And so that's how he describes it. But then Paul says, as he describes the present in verse 22, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Reconciliation implies prior estrangement, doesn't it? But now it has been accomplished, and we are, Paul says, holy, without blemish, and free from accusation. While still being purged from sin, positionally, we stand forgiven and perfect in Christ if we have trusted him for our salvation and found forgiveness of sin. Over the years, I described a site that I saw a number of years ago in Atlanta when I was there for a conference at church, which was called The Perfect Church. And it was something you just want to get a picture of, because you've got to do a double take. Is that really their name? And while I wouldn't recommend the name ever of any church, I get their point. The point is not so much are we wonderful and have no flaws, but it's a theological point, I believe. That although we clearly have flaws, although we clearly sin, although we clearly fall short, theologically, the Bible is clear that we stand as perfect before God, because we could never do that in and of ourselves, and yet that is what a holy and perfect God requires. So that's only possible through one who lived a perfect life and transfers his righteousness to us. That's what Christ does, that we might stand forgiven and as perfect before God. And that's how Paul describes the present. He then refers to the future, verse 23.